Education basically is number one, right? I mean, is that the number one thing that you can do as a human being? Get educated?
I guess, although I wouldn't carry it too far, because some of the most disastrous notions in the world have come from highly educated people with, I'm sure, high IQs.
So perhaps critical thinking with a little education.
Oh, I will settle for almost any kind of thinking. It's so rare these days.
What would you do about our school systems?
Oh my goodness! I'll try to be rational.
Do try.
They are so awful. The public has no idea what. I'm reading a book about the schools, and the woman who's writing it, Diane Ravitch, is talking about how teachers have due process before they can be fired. Now, when you look into the facts of it, right down here, and I think it was Atherton, it cost $500,000 to fire one incompetent teacher. You don't have a big enough budget, And
right.
in New York, you have something called the rubber room. These are teachers who are so incompetent that the principals don't want them in the classroom, and they get paid full salary, and they show up, and they accrue pension rights and so forth. And the last time, I forget how many millions of dollars are spent a year in New York paying for teachers who don't teach, and in fact don't do anything but show up at the same time as if they were teaching, and they read magazines or whatever they feel like doing. And this farce goes on at a time when they don't have enough money to provide the kids with decent supplies. There are kids who go to school to raise hell, and a handful of those can prevent the whole class from learning anything. Now, the logical thing would be to separate those kids out and let the ones who want to learn something. You can't do that because the ideology says no. The policy of saying that you cannot have more kids from one ethnic group disciplined in the school than from another is nonsense. I mean, groups are different from each other in umpteen ways, and to have the presumption that they are the same except for the way they're treated is nonsense. It's never been true, and I don't know why we would think it's true here today.
You were a Marxist at one time in your life. Most people will find this hard to believe, but it is true.
But it's not that unusual. Most of the leading conservative thinkers of our time did not start off as conservative. You had a couple like Bill Buckley and George Will, but I mean Milton Friedman was a liberal and a Keynesian. Hayek was a socialist. Ronald Reagan was so far left at one point the FBI was following him. So there's a huge movement from the left to the right as people get older.
Yeah, I'm well aware, as I mentioned to you earlier, as a former progressive, I understand that movement in the modern sense. Do you remember sort of what you were thinking, what appealed to you at that time about Marxism?
Yes, I mean, there was no alternative being discussed. My first job was as a Western Union messenger, and I would come home on some nights. I would take the Fifth Avenue bus, which cost all of 15 cents in those days, but I figured I'd splurge now and then. And I would drive. It would go all the way up Fifth Avenue, past all these Lord and Taylor and all these fancy places, and then across 57th Street, past Carnegie Hall, and down Riverside Drive, and that was sort of the Gold Coast area. And then as I came across this long viaduct that turned into 135th Street, suddenly there were the tenements. And I wondered, why is this? I mean, it's so different. And nothing in the schools or most of the books seem to deal with that. And Marx dealt with that. So it's like winning an election when there's only one person running.
So then what was your wake up to what was wrong with that line of thinking?
Facts. Well,
we could probably end the interview right there.
Yeah,
Facts. There you go.
And specifically, my first professional job, I was a summer intern at the U.S. Department of Labor, and I realized from dealing with these people that the U.S. Department of Labor, one of my biggest concerns was about minimum wages. It has been for a long time. And so at first I thought, well, this is good because all these people are poor and they'll get a little higher income, and so that'll be helpful. And then as I studied economics, I began to see, well, there's a downside. They may lose their jobs completely. So that is that. And so when I was at the Labor Department, I tried to talk about that to them, and eventually I came up with some test of it. And when I came up with this test, how we might test this, I was waiting to hear congratulations, you see, that I had this. And I could see these people were stunned. They said, oh, this idiot has stumbled on something that will ruin us all.
Wow.
you know? And I realized the U.S. Department of Labor had its own agenda and interests. And that did not necessarily mean that whether poor people lost their jobs from minimum wages or got higher pay was their highest priority. When you have a minimum wage law, you have more people applying for jobs in those categories than there are jobs available, because raising the wage rate causes more people to apply and employers to hire fewer because they're more expensive. And so you have a chronic surplus. Now, if you've got a chronic surplus in an industry, it costs nothing to discriminate. But if you have a competitive market, then of course it does cost something. For every person that you discriminate against who's qualified, you've got to hire somebody else, and you've got to raise that pay rate in order to get people in. So I show how competitive industries have much less discrimination than, say, regulated public utilities. When I grew up in Harlem, when you went into a movie theater, this is a little neighborhood movie theater in Harlem, there would be a kid who would walk down the aisle with you with a flashlight to show you to your seat, you see. And so now that we have so many compassionate people who want people to be paid a living wage, you stumble down the aisle to your seat the best way you can, because they're not going to pay you that kind of money, that's unrelated to productivity. The public that votes has to itself become informed and not be so easily stampeded by slogans and a few numbers thrown around, like women make X% of what men make, and so on.
Yeah.
When I was studying that some years ago, for example, I found out that young female doctors made much less money than young male doctors. And that seemed like very odd. And so, but when you look into it, you discover that young male doctors work an average of 500 hours a year more than young female doctors, and they get paid for the 500 hours. But there's no reason why the women and men should be doing the same thing. Their circumstances are different. One of the big farces out here talks about affordable housing, and they're appointing blue ribbon committees to look into why there's no affordable housing. And I think that's like appointing a blue ribbon committee to explain why the ground is wet after a rain. I mean, it's very simple. If you prevent people from building housing and the population is growing, you're going to have a housing shortage, and you won't have affordable housing. Wars in general are much easier to start than they are to stop. I mean, when that fellow in Serbia shot the Archduke, I mean, who knew that was going to cost millions of people around the world, including people from the United States about 10,000 miles away, are going to come over there and start shooting.
Yeah, the Great War.
Yeah, and you can't and I'm worried about the current trade war. You start a trade war, you may never be able to stop it in the next decade.
I want to mention one thing that you say right at the end of the book, that really what we need more than anything else, perhaps, is common decency.
Yes.
And we've kind of lost that.
It isn't common anymore. I mean, when I was going to school and we'd have fights on the schoolyard grounds, when one guy was clearly beaten, whoever was the toughest kid in the crowd would simply step in and stop it. And the other guy said, "You want to fight? You can fight me." That's
what we need in the public square now.
Yes. But I mean, it's only so much the police can do. If you don't have common decency, the cops are not going to be able to handle it. I was reading Milton Friedman's. He and his wife had a joint autobiography, and she's looking at one point. She says looking back on the days when she would ride the IND subway in Manhattan, and what a joy it was, as she said, in those long gone days. And the IND subway goes through Harlem. And Milton Friedman and his wife, when they were still courting, used to go dancing at the Savoy Ballroom. Very few people want to, and you know, the famous theme song of Duke Ellington, "Take the A Train."
Mm-hmm.
The A Train goes right through Harlem on the IND line. And so Friedman, who was only 5'2", had no fear of being mugged or even accosted, and go there. And this was common. There was a black actress who used to get finished with the play and her socializing afterwards. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, she said she would be taking the subway up to 155th Street and St. Nicholas Avenue by herself and walking home. Nobody does that these days. People can't be knowledgeable about everything, but they can be knowledgeable about the extent of their own ignorance, even if they have PhDs.